The smoke rising from the abandoned warehouse district should have been a warning, but Malachi Torres had learned that sometimes danger and opportunity looked exactly the same. He stood at the edge of what used to be Philadelphia's industrial quarter, his weathered hand gripping the rifle that had kept him alive for the past 11 months since the infection turned the world into a graveyard. Behind him, 15 souls huddled in the skeletal remains of a factory, the last of the downtown survivors, as they'd come to call themselves. They were starving, exhausted, and running out of ammunition. The warehouse fire represented a chance, however slim, that other living people might be there. Could be a trap, whispered Senna Okoye, her dark eyes scanning the ruins with the practiced vigilance of someone who'd lost too much to carelessness. Before the fall, she'd been a corporate lawyer. Now she was Malachi's second-in-command, and the only person whose judgment he trusted completely. Could be salvation, Malachi replied, watching a figure move through the smoke. Then another. And another. Not the shambling, jerking movements of the infected, but the purposeful stride of the living. They weren't alone. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. For months, they'd believed themselves the only survivors in the city. They'd watched Philadelphia die street by street, building by building, person by person. The infected owned the nights now, and increasingly, the days too. But here, impossibly, were others who'd endured. Dmitry Volkov saw them first. The former Russian Special Forces operative had been trained to notice everything, and the two figures approaching from the east stood out against the gray landscape like blood on snow. He raised his hand, signaling the others in his group to take cover. 23 people, mostly families he'd found and protected, scattered into defensive positions with practiced efficiency. They called themselves the River Guard, having claimed the waterfront as their territory when the city fell. Armed, Dmitry noted, his accent still thick despite 5 years in America. Cautious. Intelligent. Beside him, Yuki Tanabe adjusted her medical bag, her fingers finding the small pistol she'd learned to carry. She'd been a surgeon once, performing delicate operations in sterile environments. Now she stitched wounds by candlelight and amputated infected limbs with a hacksaw. The transformation still felt surreal. If they're intelligent, maybe they'll be reasonable, she said, though her voice carried little hope. Reasonableness had died with civilization. The third group watched both of the others from their vantage point in the warehouse itself. Rahim al-Farsi had led his people, a collection of former tech workers and engineers from the old financial district, to this location after intercepting radio chatter. Someone was broadcasting coordinates, calling for survivors to gather. The message had been faint, broken, but unmistakable. They numbered only 12, but what they lacked in numbers they compensated for with equipment. Rahim had managed to salvage generators, computers, and communication devices that still functioned. 3 groups, observed Isla MacLeod, the Scottish woman who'd become Rahim's strategic advisor. She'd been teaching history at the university when the outbreak began. Now she was teaching survival. All converging on the same point. Either we're all incredibly unlucky, or someone planned this. The broadcast, Rahim confirmed. It had to be deliberate. From the warehouse's upper floor, a voice suddenly echoed across the ruins, amplified, electronic, impossible. Welcome, survivors. Please, lower your weapons. We have much to discuss, and very little time. The speaker was Jovan Petrovich, a former civil engineer who'd spent the apocalypse preparing for this moment. He'd realized early that survival wasn't enough. Humanity needed to rebuild, and rebuilding required cooperation. He'd sent the coordinates. He'd started the fire as a beacon. And now, looking down at the 3 groups of wary, frightened, desperate people, he wondered if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life or taken the first step towards saving it. The infected weren't far away. They never were anymore. Jovan could hear them in the distance, that distinctive sound of dragging feet and rattling breaths that haunted every survivor's nightmares. The groups below heard it too. He watched them tense, weapons raising, eyes darting toward the shadows. You can fight each other, or you can fight them, Yovan continued, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. But you cannot do both. The infected are coming. They're always coming. And alone, each of your groups will eventually fall. Together. He paused, letting the word hang in the air like a promise. Together, we might actually have a future. Malachi locked eyes with Dmitri across the broken pavement. Then both men looked toward the warehouse where Rahim's group was emerging, hands visible but near their weapons. For a long moment, nobody moved. The sound of the infected grew louder, closer, more urgent. It was Senna who broke the silence. He's right. We're dying slowly, one day at a time. Maybe it's time to try something different. Or die faster, Dmitri muttered, but he lowered his rifle. The alliance began not with trust, but with the simple mathematics of survival. The warehouse's interior was a monument to paranoia and desperation. Yovan had constructed it carefully over weeks of solitary labor, defensive positions, escape routes, storage areas for supplies he'd scavenged. Now, filled with 47 suspicious strangers, it felt less like a fortress and more like a powder keg. The three groups had agreed to shelter together for the night, but they'd positioned themselves in separate corners, weapons close, sleep impossible. Malachi studied the others with the careful attention of someone who knew that trust killed you faster than bullets. Dimitri's river guard looked military, disciplined, harder than his own people. They had the lean, dangerous quality of survivors who'd done terrible things to stay alive. Rahim's tech collective seemed softer, more vulnerable, but they had equipment that might prove invaluable. And Jovan's people, only 8 of them, he discovered, were a mixed bag of engineers and builders, practical skills that meant nothing if you couldn't fight. This is insane, muttered Carson Liu, one of Malachi's people, a former police officer who'd seen his entire precinct fall in the first week. We don't know these people. Don't know if they're infected, don't know if they're raiders, don't know anything. We know they're still human, Senna replied quietly. That's more than we can say about most of the city. Across the warehouse, Dmitri was having a similar conversation. His people had survived by being ruthless, by taking what they needed and eliminating threats before those threats eliminated them. Cooperation felt like weakness, and weakness was death. The tall one, Malachi, he is hiding something, said Katya Romanova, a young woman who'd proven herself capable with both rifle and blade. I see it in his eyes. Fear. Maybe sickness. Everyone is hiding something, Dmitri replied. Question is whether what they hide will kill us. Yuki moved between the injured members of all 3 groups, offering medical attention regardless of affiliation. It was a calculated risk, showing value, demonstrating that cooperation had benefits, but also an act of defiance against the barbarism that had consumed the world. She cleaned a wound on Isla McLeod's arm, the result of a close encounter with infected 2 days prior. You're brave, doing this, Isla said quietly. Most doctors I've met since the fall won't touch anyone outside their own group. Too risky. Most doctors you've met are dead, Yuki replied, her voice flat. Risk is relative now. The wound is healing cleanly. You were lucky. Lucky, Isla repeated, tasting the word like poison. Haven't felt lucky in a long time. Rahim and Yovan stood together near the warehouse's makeshift radio station, the 2 men examining the equipment with the focused intensity of those who understood technology in a world that had rejected it. The radio crackled occasionally with static and fragments of voices, other survivors, perhaps, or just ghosts in the airwaves. You took a massive risk, calling us all here, Rahim said, adjusting a frequency dial. Could have been raiders. Could have been worse. Could have been salvation, Yovan countered, echoing Malachi's earlier words without knowing it. I've been mapping the infected movements for weeks. They're organizing. Getting smarter. The standard horde behavior is evolving into something more coordinated. We don't have much time before they overrun the remaining safe zones. Rahim's hands stilled on the equipment. Organizing? That's not possible. They're dead, reanimated tissue. No higher brain function. Tell that to the 1,000 infected that moved through the financial district in a coordinated sweep pattern last Tuesday, Jovan said grimly. They're adapting. Which means we need to adapt faster. The night deepened, and with it came the sounds that had become humanity's requiem. Moaning, scraping, the shuffle of countless feet. The infected gathered outside the warehouse in numbers that made Malachi's blood run cold. He counted silhouettes in the moonlight filtering through broken windows, 30, 50, 100, more. They've never clustered like this before, Senna whispered, gripping her rifle tighter. They have, Dmitri said, appearing beside them like a ghost. In my territory, 3 weeks ago. Lost good people because we didn't expect it. They're learning to hunt in packs. The 3 leaders, Malachi, Dmitri, and Rahim, found themselves standing together, united by immediate threat if nothing else. Jovan joined them, his face pale but determined. The doors will hold, he said. I reinforced them. But we need to be ready for. The crash of breaking glass cut him off. The infected were testing the warehouse's defenses, probing for weakness. Not randomly, but systematically. One window, then another, then a third. Searching for entry points. Positions. Malachi shouted, and for a moment the fragile alliance held. People scattered to defensive points, weapons raised, hearts hammering. The downtown survivors took the east wall, the river guard the west, the tech collective the north. Jovan's builders reinforced the south. But cooperation born of crisis was a fragile thing. When the first infected broke through the northern window, panic shattered organization. Someone from the tech collective fired wildly, and the bullet struck one of Dmitri's people in the shoulder. The wounded man screamed, and chaos erupted. Accusations flew faster than bullets. The river guard turned their weapons on the tech collective, who scattered in terror. Stand down. Dmitri roared, but his authority meant nothing to people who didn't follow him. Malachi grabbed the panicked shooter, a young man named Felix Chen, preventing him from firing again. Senna positioned herself between the groups, her weapon lowered but ready. We are not doing this, she said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. We are not killing each other while they wait to kill us all. The infected pressed against the warehouse walls, drawn by the noise, the scent of fear and blood and life. Inside, 47 people balanced on the knife edge between cooperation and collapse. Yuki rushed to treat the wounded river guard member, her medical bag already open. Isla helped her, demonstrating that some of Rahim's people at least understood the necessity of unity. Slowly, reluctantly, weapons lowered. But trust, already fragile, had fractured further. They survived the night, but barely. And as dawn broke over the ruins of Philadelphia, each group understood that the infected weren't their only enemy. They were also fighting themselves, fighting the instinct to see others as threats rather than allies. Jovan stood alone, watching the 3 groups maintain their suspicious distances despite the night's lesson. His grand vision of cooperation suddenly seemed impossibly naive. Perhaps humanity was too broken to rebuild. Perhaps the infection had destroyed more than just bodies, it had destroyed the very capacity for trust that civilization required. But then he noticed something. Small gestures. Yuki sharing medical supplies with Katia, teaching her how to clean wounds properly. Carson and one of Rahim's engineers comparing notes on defensive positions. Senna and Dmitri speaking quietly, their conversation intense but not hostile. Seeds. Just seeds. But seeds could grow, given time and care. If they survived long enough to plant them. The morning brought an uneasy truce and a grim discovery. Isla, conducting a perimeter check with Jovan's engineer team, found the bodies of the infected they'd repelled during the night. They weren't scattered randomly as she'd expected. They were arranged in a circle around the warehouse's southern entrance, positioned deliberately, purposefully. As if something had organized them even in death. "This isn't random," she said, her historian's mind racing. "This is communication. A message." "You're saying the infected are leaving us messages?" asked Marcus Osei, one of Joven's people, his skepticism clear. "I'm saying something is controlling them with far more intelligence than we've credited," Isla replied, photographing the arrangement with a battered camera. Documentation mattered, even at the end of the world. Especially at the end of the world. When she reported the finding to the group's informal leadership, the reaction split along predictable lines. Dimitri wanted immediate evacuation. If the infected were evolving intelligence, staying in one location was suicide. Rahim wanted to study the pattern, use it to understand their enemy. Malachi advocated caution, gathering more information before making decisions that might get people killed. Jovan listened to them argue for 10 minutes before interrupting. "We're asking the wrong question. It doesn't matter if they're intelligent or being controlled or following some virus-driven pattern we don't understand. What matters is what we do next. And I know what we need to do." He spread a map across a makeshift table, hand-drawn, annotated with symbols and notes that represented weeks of solitary observation. The map showed Philadelphia's remaining infrastructure: water treatment plants, power substations, food storage facilities, medical depots. The skeleton of civilization, waiting for someone to animate it. "We're not just surviving anymore," Jovan continued. "We're rebuilding. That starts with securing resources. Here." He pointed to a location 3 miles north. The Riverside Medical Complex. Mostly intact, well-defended position, enough medical supplies to treat hundreds of people. "Yuki, you could set up a real medical facility." Yuki leaned forward, studying the map with hungry eyes. She'd been performing surgery with vodka for anesthetic and fishing line for sutures. A real medical facility seemed like an impossible dream. "The complex is in the red zone," Dimitri objected. "Highest concentration of infected in the city. Which is why we need all 3 groups," Jovan replied. "A mission like this requires coordinated effort. Fighters, engineers, medical personnel. Everyone has a role." Malachi met Senna's eyes. She gave a slight nod. "Our people need medicine," she said. "Half of them are sick, wounded, or both. If there's a chance to get real supplies, then we're risking our lives for maybes," countered Carson. "We don't know this facility is intact. Don't know what infected are there. Don't know if these people," he gestured at the other groups, "will have our backs when things go wrong." "Things are already wrong," said a quiet voice. Everyone turned to look at Yuki, who rarely spoke in group discussions. "Things have been wrong for 11 months. We can keep running, keep hiding, keep watching people die from infections we could treat, injuries we could heal, illnesses we could cure. Or we can take a risk on something better." The silence that followed her words carried weight. Finally, Rahim spoke. "My people have surveyed that area. We know the access points, the security systems, some might still function. We can get in. My people can fight our way through whatever's waiting," Dimitri added grudgingly. "If we move fast, hit them hard, we can clear a path." Malachi nodded slowly. "My people can hold positions, establish a perimeter. If everyone does their part." "If." The word hung between them like a guillotine blade. Trust was still in short supply, but necessity was abundant. They planned for 2 days, mapping routes and assigning roles with the meticulous care of people who knew that mistakes meant death. The groups began to integrate by necessity. Katia worked with Carson on perimeter security, Felix paired with Marcus to rig explosive diversions, Isla coordinated with Senna on evacuation protocols. Small partnerships, fragile but growing stronger. The mission launched at dawn on the 3rd day. 47 people moving through Philadelphia's corpse, the largest coordinated human action the city had seen in months. They moved in formation, Dimitri's fighters at the front and flanks, Malachi's people holding the center, Rahim's tech specialists managing communications and navigation, Jovan's engineers ready to breach any barriers. The infected found them within 20 minutes. They came from the east, a horde of shambling bodies that had once been Philadelphia's citizens. Now they were just hunger and virus, driven by needs that had nothing to do with humanity. But there was something new in their movement, a coordination that confirmed Isla's fears. They didn't just attack. They flanked, they probed, they tested defenses. They're working together, Senna shouted over the gunfire. Actually cooperating. So are we, Malachi replied, dropping an infected woman with 2 precise shots. Keep moving. The alliance held. When Rahim's people faltered under a surge of infected from the north, Dimitri's fighters swept in, creating a kill zone that protected the vulnerable tech specialists. When Dimitri's ammunition ran low, Malachi's people supplied them from their reserves. When someone went down, one of Jovan's engineers, tackled by an infected child, it was Yuki who rushed in with a scalpel, severing the spine before infection could spread, and Carson who provided cover fire. They reached the medical complex at noon, having fought through 3 major horde encounters and dozens of smaller skirmishes. The building stood like a tombstone against the gray sky, silent and ominous. The main entrance had been barricaded from the inside. Someone's last stand, Isla murmured, recognizing the desperate architecture of final defenses. Rahim's people worked on an auxiliary entrance, bypassing electronic locks with manual overrides while Dimitri's fighters held a defensive perimeter. The infected were regrouping, gathering in numbers that made even Dimitri nervous. They didn't have much time. Got it, Felix announced, and the door swung open. The stench hit them first, death, decay, confinement. The complex had survivors once, but not anymore. Bodies filled the lobby, some in hospital gowns, others in medical scrubs. And more than that. Much more. The infected had gotten inside somehow, overwhelming the survivors who'd barricaded themselves in. But these infected were different. They stood motionless, arranged in rows, facing the entrance as if waiting. As if expecting them. Trap, Dimitri whispered, but it was too late. The ambush was perfectly coordinated. Infected poured from doorways and stairwells in a planned assault that spoke of intelligence, strategy, design. Someone, something, was directing them. The alliance's formation shattered under the assault, people scattering in desperate searches for cover and survival. Malachi found himself separated from his group, fighting alongside Rahim in a pharmacy while infected clawed at the reinforced glass. Dimitri and Jovan held a stairwell, an unlikely partnership born of desperation. Senna, Yuki, and Isla barricaded themselves in an operating room, protecting the wounded. The battle lasted 90 minutes that felt like years. They survived through sheer determination and the cooperation they'd practiced, each group covering the other's weaknesses, compensating for failures, supporting strengths. When Malachi's rifle jammed, Rahim's knowledge of mechanisms cleared it. When Rahim was cornered, Dimitri's tactical experience saved him. When Dimitri took a wound, Yuki's medical skill kept him fighting. They won, finally, through attrition and will. The infected fell, and the survivors stood among the corpses, bloodied and traumatized but alive. All 47 of them. Not one lost. That night, secured in the medical complex's upper floors, they didn't maintain separate groups. They sat together, sharing food and water and silence. The barriers hadn't fallen completely, but they'd cracked. They'd fought together, bled together, survived together. And in that survival, they'd found something precious and rare, the beginning of trust. The medical complex became their first true home, and with it came the difficult work of transformation from survivors to society. Yuki established a clinic in the third-floor surgical wing, her hands trembling the first time she used real anesthetic, proper surgical tools, actual antibiotics. She saved 4 lives in the first week, infections that would have been death sentences in the warehouse. Each life saved felt like a small victory against the apocalypse. But resources created new conflicts. The supplies weren't infinite, and decisions about allocation forced the Alliance to confront questions of governance. Who decided who received medical care first? Who controlled the medication? Who made the rules in this nascent civilization? The arguments erupted during a council meeting 2 weeks after securing the complex. Dmitri insisted on military rationing. Fighters received priority because they protected everyone else. Malachi argued for equal distribution. Everyone's life had equal value. Rahim proposed a merit-based system. Those who contributed most received most. Yovan advocated for need-based allocation. The sickest received care first, regardless of other factors. "You're all wrong," Isla said quietly, silencing the room. The Scottish historian had remained largely quiet in governance discussions, observing, analyzing. Now she stood, her presence commanding despite her small stature. "You're trying to rebuild the old world's systems. The systems that failed. That got us here. And you have a better idea?" Dmitri challenged. "I have a historical perspective," Isla replied. Every successful civilization balanced individual merit with collective responsibility. The strong protected the weak, and the weak supported the strong. Specialization with cooperation. "You," she pointed at Dmitri, "are right that fighters deserve respect and resources. But you," turning to Malachi, "are also right that everyone has value. And you," to Rahim, "correctly identify that contribution matters. And you," finally to Yovan, "understand that compassion is what separates us from the infected." She spread her hands. "So we do all of it. We create a system where everyone contributes according to their ability and receives according to their need, but where extraordinary contributions are recognized and rewarded. Not capitalism, not communism, not military dictatorship. Something new. Something that might actually work." The silence that followed was thoughtful rather than hostile. Senna nodded slowly. "A hybrid system. Flexible, adaptive. Like evolution," Yuki added. "Taking the best traits for survival." Over the following weeks, they built the framework of governance through trial and error. A council of representatives from each original group, making decisions by consensus when possible, by majority vote when necessary. Working committees for defense, resources, medical care, engineering, and long-term planning. Rules that everyone helped create, which meant everyone had investment in following them. The system wasn't perfect. Arguments still erupted. Carson and Katia nearly came to blows over security protocols. Felix accidentally destroyed a precious radio component, causing Rahim to question whether the tech collective was pulling its weight. Marcus criticized Malachi's leadership style as too cautious, creating tension within the downtown survivors. But they worked through it, slowly learning to communicate across the boundaries of their former divisions. And as the governance structure solidified, something unexpected emerged: hope. Yovan launched the Reconstruction Initiative, an ambitious plan to restore Philadelphia's infrastructure piece by piece. His engineers, now integrated with volunteers from all groups, began surveying the city's power grid. If they could restore electricity to even a small section of the city, the possibilities expanded exponentially. Rahim worked on communication, trying to contact other survivor groups. The radio broadcasts had increased, fragments of voices from Baltimore, New York, even reports from as far as Chicago. Humanity hadn't died. It had just fractured into 1,000 isolated pieces. Maybe those pieces could reconnect. Dmitri transformed the fighters from separate group militias into a unified defense force. Training sessions became equalizers, skill mattered more than which group you'd originated from. Katia and Carson, former rivals, became training partners and eventually friends. The defense force developed hand signals, tactical protocols, coordinated response plans. They were becoming an army. Malachi focused on expansion, carefully recruiting survivors they encountered during supply runs. The alliance grew from 47 to 62, then 81. Each new person brought skills, knowledge, different perspectives. A former teacher named Zara Ahmadi started education programs for the children they'd rescued. A mechanic called Tiago Mendez got vehicles running again. An artist, Naveen Kapoor, began documenting their story in sketches and journals, preserving history as it happened. Senna became the alliance's diplomat, handling first contact with other survivor groups. It was delicate work. Most groups had become tribal, suspicious, violent. But Senna had a gift for finding common ground, identifying mutual interests. She brokered a trade agreement with a group called the Garden Collective, exchanging medical supplies for fresh food from their greenhouse operation. She negotiated a non-aggression pact with the harbor survivors, establishing boundaries and communication protocols. The alliance's reputation spread. They were the ones who cooperated, who built instead of just scavenging. Who saw beyond immediate survival to something larger. But growth brought danger. 3 months after securing the medical complex, they encountered the Wolves, a raider group that had been terrorizing the western districts. Unlike the infected, the Wolves were very much alive, organized, and brutal. They'd heard about the Alliance's resources and wanted them. The message arrived carved into the chest of one of their scouts, a young man named Isaiah Frost who'd been on a reconnaissance mission. He stumbled into the medical complex barely alive, and the message was clear: give us half of everything you have, or we take it all. The council meeting that night was the most heated yet. Some advocated paying the tribute, avoiding conflict, preserving resources. Others wanted to fight, refusing to surrender what they'd built. Dmitri advocated a preemptive strike, taking the fight to the Wolves before they could organize. Rahim suggested negotiation, finding a peaceful solution. It was Yuki, exhausted from surgery on Isaiah, who cut through the debate. "We've built something worth protecting," she said, her blood-stained hands resting on the table. "Not just supplies. Not just buildings. We've built proof that people can still work together, still create instead of destroy. If we surrender that to threats, we're saying it has no value. If we become raiders ourselves through aggression, we're destroying what we built. We defend, but we don't initiate violence. We protect what we've created, but we don't become the wolves to fight them." The council voted. They would defend, would fortify, would prepare. But they would also offer the wolves an alternative: join the alliance, contribute rather than steal, be part of something larger than a gang of thugs. The message they sent back was simple: we've lost too much to lose what we've rebuilt. But we've also learned that we're stronger together than apart. Join us or leave us alone. Attack us, and we'll defend ourselves. The wolves' response came a week later, at midnight, with fire and fury. 100 raiders, armed and organized, assaulting the medical complex from 3 sides. They expected an easy victory against a group of naive survivors playing at civilization. They found an army instead. The Alliance's defense was everything they'd prepared for. Coordinated, disciplined, ruthless in protecting what they'd built. Dimitri's training showed in every movement, every tactical decision. The wolves broke against their defenses like water against stone. By dawn, the raiders were retreating, having lost 30 people and gained nothing. The Alliance lost 7 defenders, each death a knife to their collective heart. They held a memorial service, honoring those who'd fallen protecting the dream of civilization reborn. And in that grief, the last barriers between the original 3 groups finally dissolved. They weren't the downtown survivors, the River Guard, and the Tech Collective anymore. They were just the Alliance. One people, one purpose. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Philadelphia's ruins in snow that made the infected easier to see but harder to fight. The cold slowed them, but it slowed the living too, and the Alliance faced a crisis of resources. Food supplies dwindled. Heating fuel became precious. Medical supplies, even with the complex's reserves, began to run dangerously low. The council meetings grew tense as scarcity revealed the fault lines that cooperation had papered over. Old divisions resurfaced, not between the original three groups, but between new factions, those who'd been with the alliance from the beginning and newer recruits who hadn't earned trust yet, those who wanted aggressive expansion versus those who advocated cautious consolidation, those who believed in democracy versus those who thought survival required stronger leadership. Yoven watched his vision of cooperation straining under the weight of winter and scarcity. He'd been so focused on bringing people together that he hadn't fully considered how to keep them together when times got hard. And times were getting very hard indeed. The breaking point came when a supply convoy was ambushed, not by raiders or infected, but by a group from within the alliance. 6 people, including Carson Liu, had decided that resources were being distributed unfairly. They'd taken matters into their own hands, stealing from the common stores and fleeing into the ruins. The betrayal cut deep. Carson had been with Malachi from the beginning, one of the original downtown survivors. If someone like him could abandon the alliance, who else might follow? We hunt them down, Dmitri said flatly. Make an example. Show that betrayal has consequences. They're desperate people making desperate choices, Malachi countered, though his voice carried the pain of personal betrayal. We find them, we talk to them, we understand what drove them to this. We're all desperate, Senna interjected. That's not an excuse. But Dmitri, killing our own people makes us no better than the wolves. We need a middle path. The debate raged for hours, revealing deeper anxieties. If the alliance couldn't maintain cohesion through one winter, how could it possibly rebuild civilization? Maybe humanity was too selfish, too tribal, too broken for cooperation to work long-term. Rahim had been quiet during the debate, working at his radio equipment in the corner of the council room. Suddenly, he raised a hand, silencing the argument. You need to hear this. He adjusted the frequency, and a voice filled the room. Clear, strong, organized. CDC facility in Atlanta remains operational. Repeat, this is Dr. Sarah Chen broadcasting from the Centers for Disease Control. We have a working laboratory and have made significant progress understanding the infection vector. Seeking contact with any organized survivor groups. We believe a treatment may be possible, but we need resources, personnel, and coordination. Please respond if you can hear this message. The room fell silent. A cure. The word no one had dared speak for almost a year. The infection that had destroyed civilization might be reversible. It's a trap, Dmitri said immediately. Has to be. Too convenient. Too hopeful. Or it's real, Yuki replied, her medical mind racing. The CDC had the best research facilities in the world. If anyone could develop a treatment, it would be them. Atlanta is 800 miles away, Isla noted, her historian's practicality cutting through the excitement. Through infected territory, raider groups, collapsed infrastructure. It might as well be on the moon. But if it's real, Yovan said quietly, if there's even a chance of a cure, we have to try. That's not just survival. That's hope. That's a future. The debate shifted. No longer about Carson's betrayal or resource distribution, but about something larger. A mission that could unite them, give purpose beyond mere survival. If they could reach Atlanta, could make contact with the CDC, could contribute to developing a cure, that would be rebuilding civilization in the truest sense. But it would require everything they had. Resources, personnel, risk. And it would require trust on a scale they hadn't yet achieved. They'd have to believe in each other completely, because an expedition to Atlanta would mean splitting the alliance, sending their best people into terrible danger while leaving the rest vulnerable. Senna proposed that they respond to the broadcast first, establish communication, confirm the CDC facility was legitimate before committing to the journey. Rahim worked through the night, finally establishing a shaky connection with Dr. Chen's facility. The conversation was broken, filled with static, but the crucial details came through. The CDC had a skeleton crew of 43 people. They'd maintained quarantine protocols, kept the facility secure, continued research even as the world fell apart. They had a potential treatment that showed promise in limited trials, but they needed broader testing, more subjects, resources they didn't have. They were calling for a coalition of survivor groups to pool resources and knowledge. "They want us to come to them," Rahim summarized after the transmission ended. "Bring samples of the infected from our region, medical personnel, research data. In exchange, they'll share the treatment protocol if it proves successful." The council wrestled with the decision for 3 days. Finally, they voted. 10 people would make the journey to Atlanta. The Alliance's best fighters, brightest minds, most capable survivors. It was a desperate gamble, but desperation had become their normal state. Dmitri would lead the expedition, his military experience made him the obvious choice. Yuki would go as medical specialist. Isla would serve as navigator and strategist. They'd take volunteers from across the Alliance, people whose skills and courage might make the difference between success and failure. The announcement sparked a wave of volunteers. More than 50 people offered to go, each with their own reasons. Some sought adventure, others redemption, still others simply wanted to be part of something historic. The selection process was agonizing, choosing who would risk everything and who would stay behind to protect what they'd built. Malachi shocked everyone by volunteering. As one of the Alliance's founding leaders, his place should have been in Philadelphia, maintaining stability. But Carson's betrayal had shaken him, made him question whether he could lead effectively anymore. Maybe, he thought, he could serve better by risking everything for a cure. Senna convinced him to stay. "The Alliance needs you here," she said. "Needs your steadiness, your compassion. I'll go in your place. Someone has to represent our interests, make sure we have a voice in what happens in Atlanta." In the end, the expedition consisted of 10 people who represented the Alliance's best hope: Dmitri, Yuki, Isla, Senna, Felix, Katia, Marcus, Tiago, Zara, and Naveen. A mix of fighters, thinkers, builders, healers. They would carry samples of the infected, medical data, and the hopes of everyone they left behind. The night before departure, the Alliance gathered in the complex's atrium. Jovan had rigged lighting, actual electric lighting, powered by generators they'd restored, and for a few hours, they could pretend the world hadn't ended. People shared food, stories, music. Someone had found a guitar, and old songs filled the air, music that reminded them of what had been lost and what might be regained. Malachi stood with the expedition members, trying to memorize their faces. "Bring back hope," he said simply. "That's all we ask. Come back with hope." The next morning, the expedition left Philadelphia in a convoy of repaired vehicles, carrying supplies and dreams. Those who remained watched until the vehicles disappeared into the ruins, then turned back to the work of survival. But something had shifted. The Alliance had a purpose now beyond mere existence. They were part of something larger, connected to a network of survivors working toward a cure. They weren't alone in the darkness anymore. 2 weeks after the expedition's departure, they found Carson and his group. Not through hunting or pursuit, but because Carson came back voluntarily, half-starved and frostbitten, begging for forgiveness. He'd discovered that betraying the Alliance meant facing the world alone again, and the world alone was impossible to survive. The council debated his fate. Some wanted him exiled permanently. Others advocated forgiveness. Malachi, surprising everyone, spoke in Carson's defense. "We're all broken," he said. "We've all done things to survive that shame us. The question isn't whether Carson deserves forgiveness. The question is who we want to be. A society that executes the desperate, or one that believes people can change, can heal, can be better?" They voted to allow Carson back, but on probation. He would work to regain trust, prove through actions that his return was genuine. It was mercy, but not naive mercy. Redemption would have to be earned. The precedent mattered. The Alliance wasn't just surviving, it was creating a justice system, a moral framework, a set of values that could outlast any individual. They were building civilization from the rubble, one difficult decision at a time. 3 months passed without word from the Atlanta expedition. 3 months of waiting, working, hoping, and fearing. The Alliance grew to over 200 people, refugees from across the region drawn by reports of a community that functioned, that offered safety and purpose. But growth strained resources and tested the governance structures they'd created. Rahim maintained constant radio vigil, listening for any signal from the expedition. The airwaves carried fragments of broadcasts from other survivor groups, some cooperative, others hostile, all struggling with the same challenges of scarcity and infected. The world was slowly, painfully, trying to knit itself back together. Then, on a gray March morning, the radio crackled to life with Senna's voice. "Alliance, this is Expedition Team. We've reached Atlanta. We've made contact with the CDC. And you need to hear this." What followed was the most important broadcast in the Alliance's history. Dr. Sarah Chen spoke, her voice carrying scientific precision mixed with exhausted hope. The treatment worked. Not perfectly, not easily, but it worked. They'd successfully reversed infection in early-stage cases, preventing the transformation into infected. They couldn't cure those who'd fully turned, but they could stop the spread, could save people who'd been exposed but not yet transformed. The implications staggered comprehension. The infection could be stopped. Humanity could fight back. The end of the world wasn't inevitable. But the treatment required resources they didn't have. Rare chemicals, specialized equipment, laboratory facilities. The CDC could produce enough for maybe 100 doses per month. To scale up production, to manufacture enough to actually make a difference, they needed a coordinated effort across multiple survivor groups, pooling resources and knowledge. "We're calling it the Restoration Initiative," Dr. Chen explained. "A network of survivor communities working together to produce and distribute the treatment. Atlanta coordinates research. Other sites manufacture components. Distribution hubs ensure equitable access. It requires unprecedented cooperation, but the alternative is extinction." Malachi listened to the broadcast with tears streaming down his face. This was what Yovan had envisioned from the beginning, different groups coming together, rebuilding civilization through cooperation. Not just one alliance, but a network spanning the continent. The expedition would remain in Atlanta for 6 months, helping establish production facilities and coordinating with other survivor groups. But they'd sent detailed plans, formulas, specifications. The Alliance could begin preparing to become a regional hub, manufacturing treatment components and distributing them to smaller survivor groups. The work began immediately. Jovan's engineers, now numbering 25, started identifying the facilities and equipment they'd need. Yuki, before leaving, had trained a dozen medical assistants. They would need to become full physicians, capable of administering the treatment and training others. Rahim's communication network became vital, coordinating with other groups, sharing information, building the infrastructure for the Restoration Initiative. But not everyone celebrated. The treatment's existence created new divisions. Some survivor groups saw it as leverage, hoarding information and supplies to gain power over others. Raiders attacked CDC supply convoys, stealing treatment doses to sell at extortionate prices. The wolves, decimated but not destroyed, re-emerged as treatment thieves, preying on the desperate. The Alliance faced a choice: keep their treatment production secret, using it only for their own people, or share it widely and risk becoming targets. The council meeting was contentious, fear-battling ideology. "We share," Malachi said firmly. "Not because it's safe, but because it's right. We've built something here based on cooperation, on the idea that together we're stronger." Hoarding the treatment betrays everything we've worked for. Hoarding the treatment keeps us alive, countered Dmitri, or rather, his second-in-command Alexei Volkov, Dmitri's younger brother who'd emerged as a leader in the fighter ranks. Altruism is a luxury we can't afford. Altruism is the only thing that separates us from the infected, Isla had written in a message read aloud by Malachi. Even from Atlanta, her historical perspective shaped alliance policy. Civilizations that hoarded resources collapsed. Those that distributed them survived. We're not just fighting the infection. We're fighting the selfishness that created the conditions for civilization's collapse in the first place. The vote was close, but the decision held: they would share. The alliance would become a regional treatment hub, manufacturing and distributing to any survivor group that needed it, asking only that recipients contribute what they could to the restoration initiative. It made them targets. The wolves attacked 3 times in 2 months, each assault more coordinated than the last. Other raider groups emerged, drawn by the alliance's resources. The infected, as if sensing humanity's resurgence, seemed to attack with renewed ferocity. But something else emerged too: gratitude and cooperation. Survivor groups that received treatment became allies, contributing resources and personnel. The alliance grew from a single community to a network spanning eastern Pennsylvania. The Garden Collective, the Harbor Survivors, the University Remnant, the Factory Town, separate groups maintaining independence but cooperating on treatment production and distribution. Carson Liu, working to redeem himself, volunteered for the most dangerous assignments. He led supply runs into infected territory, evacuated survivors from collapsed communities, fought raiders with a ferocity born of guilt and determination. Slowly, grudgingly, people began to trust him again. Redemption, Malachi reflected, was possible even in the apocalypse. Maybe especially in the apocalypse, when every day offered new chances to choose who you wanted to be. 6 months after reaching Atlanta, the expedition returned. The convoy rolled into Philadelphia on a warm September afternoon, and the entire alliance turned out to greet them. But the celebration was muted, because only 7 of the original 10 returned. Felix had died fighting raiders outside Richmond. Zara had succumbed to infection after being bitten during a supply run, choosing to end her life before transformation rather than risk others. Naveen had stayed in Atlanta, his artistic documentation too valuable to the CDC's work to spare. The survivors carried grief like scars, but they also carried triumph. The restoration initiative was working. Treatment production was increasing. The infection spread was slowing. Humanity had a future again, however fragile. Senna embraced Malachi, and in that moment, the 2 original leaders understood what they'd accomplished. They'd started with 3 groups of desperate survivors, barely trusting each other enough to spend one night under the same roof. They'd built a community, a network, a movement. They'd proven that cooperation wasn't just possible but powerful. "We're really doing this," Malachi whispered. "Rebuilding civilization." "We're trying," Senna replied. "That's all we can do. Try, and hope it's enough." Dmitri returned changed, quieter, more thoughtful. The journey to Atlanta had shown him the scope of the collapse and the scale of what remained to be rebuilt. "There are so many people," he said at the first council meeting after his return. "Scattered, isolated, struggling. The alliance isn't just about Philadelphia anymore. We're a model. Other communities are watching, trying to replicate what we've built. We have a responsibility to help them, to spread not just the treatment but the cooperation that makes the treatment possible." The alliance entered a new phase. No longer just survivors, they were rebuilders. Ambassadors traveled to distant communities, teaching cooperation and treatment production. Engineers restored infrastructure, connecting separate survivor enclaves with repaired roads and bridges. Teachers educated children in the old knowledge and new realities. Farmers reclaimed land, planting crops for harvests measured in years, not days. It was hard, slow, frustrating work. For every success, there were setbacks. Communities fell to raiders or infected. Bridges collapsed. Crops failed. People died from injuries, illness, violence, despair. The apocalypse hadn't ended, they just learned to live in it better. But they persisted. And slowly, impossibly, the world began to heal. 5 years after the Alliance's formation, Philadelphia's medical complex had become something that would have been unrecognizable to those first desperate survivors who'd sheltered there. The complex anchored a thriving community of over 3,000 people, with satellite settlements connected by repaired roads and functional communication networks. Electric lighting illuminated the streets at night. Greenhouses provided fresh food year-round. A school taught 200 children the knowledge of the old world and the skills of the new. Malachi Torres stood on the complex's roof, looking out over what they'd built. He was graying now, the apocalypse's stress aging him beyond his 41 years. But he'd lived to see his vision of cooperation become reality. The Restoration Initiative had succeeded beyond anyone's dreams. The infection still existed, still killed, but it was manageable now. Humanity had learned to fight back. Below him, people went about their lives. Not just surviving, but living. Children played in streets that 5 years ago had belonged to the infected. Markets traded goods produced by human hands. Couples married, planning futures that extended beyond the next day. It wasn't the old world, that was gone, and good riddance to parts of it, but it was a world worth living in. Senna found him there, as she often did. They'd become close over the years, the bond of shared struggle creating intimacy that transcended romance. She carried a letter, and her face told him everything before she spoke. "It's Jovan," she said quietly. The illness had started 6 months ago. Cancer, Yuki suspected, though diagnostic equipment remained scarce. Jovan had refused treatment, insisting that limited medical resources go to those with longer lives ahead. He'd spent his final months designing one last project, a monument to the Alliance's formation, a memorial to everyone who died rebuilding civilization. He passed this morning, Senna continued. Peacefully, surrounded by his people. He wanted you to have this. The letter was vintage Jovan, practical, unsentimental, focused on the future. He wrote about the Alliance's next challenges, suggestions for governance structures, ideas for further expansion. Only in the final paragraph did emotion break through. "We did it, Malachi. We brought strangers together and made them family. We took the apocalypse's fragments and built something beautiful. I'm not afraid to die, because I've seen what we created. It will outlast me. Outlast all of us. That's what civilization means, building something that transcends individual lives. Thank you for believing when belief seemed insane. Thank you for trusting when trust was suicide. You gave me hope, and hope gave me purpose. I die content." Malachi read the letter 3 times, tears blurring the words. Jovan had been the Alliance's architect, the one who'd taken a desperate gamble on human cooperation. Without him, none of this existed. And now he was gone, leaving them to continue the work alone. Except they weren't alone. That was the point, had always been the point. The memorial service drew thousands. Not just from Philadelphia, but from the network of allied communities that had adopted the cooperation model. The Garden Collective sent representatives. The harbor survivors came in force. Even the remnants of the wolves attended. The raider group had dissolved, its members scattered or integrated into legitimate communities. Former enemies stood together, united by grief and gratitude. Dmitri spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "I didn't trust him at first. Didn't trust any of this. I'd seen too much death to believe in cooperation. But Jovan had vision where I had only fear. He saw what we could build while I could see only what we'd lost. He made me believe again. Made all of us believe." Yuki spoke about Jovan's compassion, his insistence that medicine serve everyone equally. Rahim described how Jovan's engineering genius had laid the groundwork for restored infrastructure. Isla, still in Atlanta but connected by radio, shared historical perspective, how Jovan's model of cooperation was being studied and replicated across the continent. When it was Malachi's turn, he struggled to find words adequate to the moment. Finally, he simply said, "Jovan brought us together. Now we stay together." That's his legacy. That's how we honor him. They built the memorial over the following year, a towering structure in the complex's central plaza, engraved with the names of everyone who died rebuilding civilization. Thousands of names, each representing a life sacrificed, a story ended, a contribution to the future they'd never see. Jovan's name headed the list, but it was far from alone. Felix Chen, Zara Ahmadi, Isaiah Frost. Names from the early days, people who'd fallen fighting infected or raiders or simple bad luck. Names from later years, people who'd died in accidents, from illness, from age. The memorial grew each year, a grim accounting of what reconstruction cost. But next to the memorial, they built something else, a garden. Not utilitarian greenhouses for food production, but a space of beauty. Flowers, trees, pathways designed for contemplation. A reminder that civilization meant more than survival. It meant creating space for joy, for reflection, for the human spirit to breathe. Carson Liu, fully redeemed now, tended the memorial garden with devotion that bordered on obsession. He'd lived when others had died, had betrayed the alliance and been forgiven. The weight of survival and grace drove him to preserve the memory of those who'd given everything. "Do you think it's enough?" he asked Malachi one evening, the two old survivors sitting among the flowers. "All of this? Does it justify what we've lost?" Malachi considered the question seriously. 5 years of rebuilding, thousands of lives saved, civilization slowly returning to the wasteland. But also thousands dead, the world they'd known destroyed, innocence and normalcy gone forever. "I don't know," he admitted. "Some days, I think we've built something miraculous. Other days, I can't stop thinking about everyone who isn't here to see it. The justification isn't for us to decide. We did what we had to do to survive. The future will judge whether it was enough." The alliance continued evolving. As the infection became manageable, new challenges emerged. Governance structures that worked for 3,000 people strained under 10,000. Resource distribution systems needed constant refinement. Disputes between allied communities required diplomatic solutions. They were learning to be a civilization again, remembering lessons that had taken humanity millennia to learn the first time. Senna became the alliance's primary diplomat, traveling between communities, mediating disputes, building connections. Her work prevented 3 potential wars in 2 years, transforming conflicts into cooperation. She was exhausted, constantly moving, never home, but she persisted because the alternative was collapse. Dmitri, aging and wounded from too many battles, transitioned from active fighter to strategic advisor. He trained the next generation of defenders, instilling discipline and tactical knowledge. But he also taught them something he'd had to learn, that fighting was a last resort, that true strength lay in preventing conflicts rather than winning them. Rahim's communication network became the spine of the Eastern Survivor Alliance. Radio connections linked dozens of communities, sharing information, coordinating responses to threats, distributing resources. He'd built the nervous system of a new civilization, connections that turned isolated settlements into a functioning society. Yuki trained a generation of physicians, passing on knowledge that would have died with her otherwise. Medical schools were reopening, crude but functional. She was training her own replacement, preparing for a future that would continue after her time. Isla returned from Atlanta after 7 years, her historical documentation complete. She'd compiled the definitive account of civilization's collapse and reconstruction, tens of thousands of pages, hundreds of interviews, analysis of what failed and what succeeded. It was a guidebook for humanity, lessons purchased in blood and grief. Universities were beginning to reopen, and Isla's work would teach the next generation how to build better. The Alliance's 10th anniversary arrived quietly. No grand celebrations, just a day of remembrance and quiet pride. Malachi stood before the memorial, reading names he recognized, remembering faces that haunted his dreams. So many dead. So much lost. But around him, life continued. Children who'd never known the old world played without understanding what games meant to people who'd survived the apocalypse, the simple joy of childhood in safety. Teenagers attended school, learning to read and write and think critically. Adults worked, building and maintaining the infrastructure that made everything possible. That evening, the council met, the same governing structure they'd established years ago, though the faces had changed. New representatives from communities that hadn't existed during the Alliance's formation. Younger voices, people who'd come of age during Reconstruction. They discussed challenges, a dispute over water rights between two communities, reports of a new infected variant that might resist the treatment, a proposal to establish a university, a request for engineering support from a distant settlement. Malachi listened more than he spoke now, letting younger leaders navigate the problems. His time was passing. The alliance he'd helped found had outgrown its founders. That was success, he reminded himself. Building something that didn't need you anymore. Late that night, alone in his quarters, Malachi wrote his own letter. Not to any specific person, but to the future. A message to be read by people who'd never known the apocalypse, who'd live in the world the Alliance was rebuilding. We failed you, he wrote. We, the generation who allowed civilization to collapse. We were selfish, short-sighted, divided. We couldn't cooperate even when cooperation meant survival. And the world died because of our failures. But we learned. The apocalypse taught us what we should have known, that we need each other, that cooperation isn't weakness but strength, that civilization is a choice we make every day. We came together as strangers and became family. We built from ruins because we had no choice, but also because we finally understood what mattered. You'll face your own challenges. Different from ours, but equally important. And when you do, remember this, cooperation is possible. Even when it seems impossible, even when every instinct screams for selfishness and isolation, people can come together. Can build together. Can sacrifice for each other. We weren't heroes. We were desperate survivors who learned to trust each other because the alternative was extinction. But desperation revealed something essential about humanity: we're better together than apart. Honor our dead. Learn from our mistakes. Build something better than what we lost. And remember that civilization isn't buildings or technology or institutions. It's the choice to cooperate, to see strangers as potential allies rather than threats, to build bridges instead of walls. We gave you a foundation. The rest is up to you. He sealed the letter and placed it in the memorial's cornerstone, a message to centuries he'd never see. Malachi Torres died 3 years later, peacefully, surrounded by the family the Alliance had become. His funeral drew tens of thousands from across the survivor network. They mourned a founder, a leader, a man who'd chosen cooperation when isolation seemed safer. But they also celebrated. Because the Alliance continued. The cooperation he'd helped build had taken root, spreading across the continent. Humanity was healing, slowly but undeniably. The apocalypse's wounds were scars now, permanent but no longer bleeding. Senna spoke at his funeral, her voice carrying across the crowd. Malachi believed in us when we didn't believe in ourselves. He saw potential where others saw only threat. Something went wrong with this response, please try again.